December 16th, 1985. Big Paul Castellano, reputed don of New York's powerful Gambino crime family, stops in for a visit with his lawyer, James LaRossa.
What we did that last time we met was talk about how well we thought the trial was going, how we were looking forward to its conclusion.
Then Castellano and his driver, Tommy Bellotti, head for dinner at Spark Steakhouse.
As Castellano and Tommy Bellotti drove up in front of Spark Steakhouse, four men dressed in white coats and Russian hats came up to both of them.
The New York mob has been turned completely upside down, and defense attorney James LaRossa is suddenly in the middle of a mafia war.
Hello, I'm Bruce Cutler, defense attorney. We lawyers fight a war of our own, a war for justice. There are rules, and it's supposed to be gracious. But take it from me, the heat can get turned up pretty high. So how do you fight for your man without making enemies on the other side? You can ask James LaRossa. From his earliest cases to the legendary commission trial, LaRossa has defended some rough characters and kept his hands clean, even when his clients were being gunned down in the streets.
Born and raised in Brooklyn, James LaRossa is practicing law in his 20s before he even goes to law school. While serving in the Marine Corps in Korea, LaRossa volunteers to defend soldiers facing courts-martial.
I'd always wanted to be a lawyer, and I thought, what a great way to learn, whether I really liked it or not. It's like going to a movie almost, you know? See if you like it or not. And I did like it.
In 1962, after graduating from Fordham Law School, LaRossa finally begins practicing law, not as a defender, but as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. LaRossa feels a certain sympathy with the other side of the aisle, and after 3.5 years, he opens his own practice.
I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a defense lawyer. I climbed the fence, and I landed on my feet, and off I was running, ready to represent people accused of crimes.
For the first few years, LaRossa defends the usual suspects of Brooklyn's criminal courts: bank robbers and low-level narcotics dealers and truck hijackers who feed off the traffic in and out of Idlewild International Airport. But his ambitions do not end there.
Every young criminal defense lawyer looks for the case that's going to propel him from being a journeyman into something that potentially could be special. My case was a man by the name of Daniel Motto.
In 1967, Daniel Motto, boss of the Bakers Union in New York, is accused of helping the mob bribe corrupt city officials.
I was shocked that he took me because I was really young, and he liked the background of me being a former federal prosecutor. I think he thought I was smarter than I really was.
James Marcus, a deputy mayor under New York's John Lindsay, is accused of conspiring with mob leader Tony Dux Corallo to award a city sanitation job to Corallo's pet contractor. Daniel Motto is accused of being a go-between, of introducing Marcus to the contractor.
Marcus became a witness, and a guy by the name of Herb Itkin became a witness, a defrocked lawyer who had committed more crimes than most people ever get a chance to in a lifetime, had never gone to jail, and always became a government witness and always got his way out of the thing. The theme was to prove to the jury that you couldn't accept the testimony of these two scoundrels.
It doesn't work. Motto is convicted on June 3, 1968, and gets 5 years. The Marcus case has been front-page news for weeks, and so has James LaRossa.
People say, you lose a case, how does it help you? I think it helps if they see the kind of work you did. I think it helps that your name becomes one that they recognize.
LaRossa is ascending to a stature at which the big cases come looking for him, including mafia cases.
In the 1970s, the mob got a stranglehold on many industries in the city and the metropolitan area. Construction industry, the trucking industry, the garment center, private sanitation, as well as, the normal things like extortion rackets, gambling, loan sharking, bookmaking, you name it.
The FBI had terrific numbers in their convictions in the organized crime area. But then if you broke that down and you looked at where those numbers were, they were convicting gamblers, low-level non-members. They were not getting to the people that called the shots.
You were just, in essence, helping the chain of succession. 5 people would go to jail, 5 people would take over. The institution would be just as strong, the institution would be just as rich, the institution would be just as powerful. Maybe it'd take a little hit, but it'd be able to survive.
In 1976, the feds believe they have made a big score against the mob, arresting a lanky Samba good fella named Paul Castellano on charges of loan sharking. Castellano hires James LaRossa.
He was an interesting man. He was a butcher. He and his sons ran a group of butcher shops. He's the only person I know that's been accused of organized crime that read the Wall Street Journal every day.
The feds believe that Big Paul is on the verge of becoming a very important gangster. Castellano is also the brother-in-law of Carlo Gambino, Don of the New York Gambino crime family. Carlo has appointed Castellano as his heir apparent.
Carlo Gambino was interested in behaving more like a sophisticated criminal as opposed to a thug. He felt that the way to keep from being prosecuted and arrested and convicted and sent to prison was to do it with your brains instead of your brawn. His brother-in-law was a businessman, so he picked Paul Castellano to be the boss.
It's a real coup for LaRossa, handling the trial of New York's number 2 gangster. And in October 1976, before the case is even complete, Castellano gets promoted.
Between the time of his indictment and the time of the trial, Carlo Gambino died a natural death, and the newspapers all announced that Castellano was the new anointed boss. So he became a big name unto himself.
One funeral later, LaRossa is defending the Gambino's new boss, and that means the mob is expecting big things. For James LaRossa, the stakes are suddenly much higher.
You're watching Mouthpiece on the History Channel. In 1976, defense attorney James LaRossa is defending the Gambino family's number 2 man, Paul Castellano, when Paul gets promoted to number 1. Overnight, LaRossa is representing someone who may be the most powerful underworld figure in America.
The basis of the case against Paul Castellano was the testimony of a nephew by marriage who testified that he overheard Paul Castellano admitting to being in the loan sharking business. Under the then case law, the statement of an individual who's charged with a crime alone isn't sufficient to convict him.
By the time of the trial, the nephew, Arthur Berardelli, has mysteriously decided not to testify in court against his mafia uncle. All the prosecutors have is Arthur's original statement. LaRossa knows that if he puts on a big defense, he may give the government some new angles from which to attack his client. So he does the opposite. LaRossa tiptoes through the evidence.
It took a little discipline to stick within the parameters of that being the only evidence the government had.
When the prosecution finishes putting on its case, LaRossa rises and files a motion for dismissal. His motion is granted. Castellano walks.
The result got a huge amount of publicity and huge accolades within the legal profession for me, whether I was entitled to them or not.
But the celebration will be short. Top mobsters like Castellano don't know it yet, but the era when a talented defense lawyer can get a government case neatly dismissed is quickly coming to a close. The feds are ready to launch a new weapon against the mob, a weapon designed largely by a Justice Department lawyer named G. Robert Blakey.
When I was in the Department of Justice, we prosecuted Tony Accardo for tax evasion. He put on his tax returns that he was a salesman for Foxhead Beer, and it was false. Now, who was Tony Accardo? He was the head of the outfit. He was engaged in a wide range of crime. The newspapers knew that, but the jury didn't know it.
It was very difficult to get the leadership of an organized crime family. The leaders don't go out on the street. They don't shake down people with loan sharking cases. They don't conduct gambling operations personally. They don't generally commit murders personally.
What we had to do was let the judge and jury see the whole picture, see that Tony Accardo was a boss, see that the outfit was an enterprise.
For Blakey, enterprise is the key. So he drafts a new anti-mafia law which passes in 1970, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Statute, known as RICO for short. RICO is a gun designed with a single purpose: to attack the organization of organized crime.
What you really have is an entrepreneur criminal organization that engages in a diverse pattern of criminal behavior. I had to get the pattern concept built into RICO.
There's no doubt it was a brilliantly devised act. He did it by making it so simple that the very act of somehow being involved in an enterprise implicated you. That's the real executioner's switch to get the bosses.
The idea of the racketeering prosecutions was to prosecute the organization as an organization or as an institution. Put as many of the people in jail as possible, as you could prove cases against, and then seize as much of their assets as possible so that somebody couldn't just come over and take over the business and carry it on.
Unfortunately, for 10 years, it just sat on the shelf and was not used correctly until the late 70s.
One of the key tests of the new law comes in 1979, the trial of union boss Anthony Scotto.
Tony Scotto was a dock boss, a union official who managed to run the rackets on the waterfront for the Gambino crime family.
He was a very powerful union leader who was well sought out for support by all the political figures.
In January 1979, the government is test firing the RICO law and indicts Scotto for shaking down waterfront contractors. Scotto, they say, is engaging in racketeering, a criminal enterprise.
Mr. Scotto categorically rejects and denies each and every one of these allegations.
As the Rossa heads into trial, he and his client discover that Scotto has been secretly recorded by some of his dock contractors, talking about payoffs.
In Rossa's opening statement, he did something that's very unusual. He did not take the position that these payments had never been made, because he had heard in the discovery, the tapes, he knew they'd been made.
And Jimmy very imaginatively shifted the focus from any kind of alleged illicit purpose for the conversations, suggesting that they really had to do with an election campaign.
It was true that the monies were going to political candidates, so certainly we had to shift in the middle and say, wait a minute, yes, it's true, but it had nothing to do with criminal activity.
To reinforce the impression of Scotto's good side, La Rossa brings in the governor of New York, Hugh Carey, as well as 2 former mayors of the city and the chief of the AFL-CIO, to vouch for Scotto's character.
That was a very bold defense for him. Traditionally, defense lawyers save the character witnesses for the end. I think La Rossa's strategy was to put these people on ahead of Scotto to sort of condition the jury before Scotto took the stand that Scotto was really a good guy.
His name was well known in philanthropic circles and political circles. And that's how you tried to offset it, by saying one isn't consistent with the other, so it doesn't work.
Jimmy has that empathy for the client, has empathy for his or her predicament, and goes to court and fights very hard.
On November 9th, 1979, the judge instructs the jury to deliberate 4 RICO counts of racketeering and conspiracy to racketeer, and 56 separate counts of bribery and influence peddling. RICO, the government's new weapon, is loaded, aimed, and ready to fire.
You're watching Mouthpiece on the History Channel.
While defending Longshoremen's union official Anthony Scotto from charges of mob racketeering in 1979, James La Rossa's case has been battered by government tapes showing that his client took money from contractors doing business with the union. So La Rossa's strategy is to paint Scotto as a gregarious and complex union man, an image that Scotto himself has carefully cultivated.
Tony Scotto won the case in the newspapers. He was an engaging guy himself, and a lot of columnists kind of took the position that he's being railroaded.
It was clear that the money was going to political purposes, but the jury wasn't ready to accept all of that, even though the proof was there. And they convicted him of, in effect, bribery of the shipping industry.
We often say the lawyers don't make the facts. You know, Jimmy La Rossa wasn't there when the tape recordings were made. He had to play the cards that he was dealt, and I think he did an admirable job.
Encouraged by his success with Scotto, the federal government begins to jump on the RICO bandwagon.
What the agents tried to do was, instead of taking a focus on individual crimes, they tried to use intelligence to get a picture of the total organization. Who was the leadership? Who was the muscle? Who was behind the finance?
Part of the FBI's dedication to RICO can be traced to a single weekend a few months after Scotto's conviction. At a seminar on the Cornell University campus, two enterprising FBI agents, James Kostler and Jules Bonavolanta, listened to Robert Blakey lecture on his brainchild, the RICO statute.
When he started to speak that night, Kostler and I looked at each other. It was like we had an epiphany. We said, here it is. This is what we got to do. This is how we're going to do it. As we left, Blakey said to me, someday I dream of the boss of every family being indicted, the commission.
Of all the mafia targets that an FBI man could dream of, there is none higher than the commission, the Senate, House, and Supreme Court of the American mob.
The commission goes back to the 1930s. Before the 1930s, the families in New York were constantly bickering and fighting with each other over control of criminal activity. There was a war that broke out, which resulted in the death of a lot of the leadership of the various families. Out of that war, Lucky Luciano conceived the idea of a commission that would bring the leaders of the families together so that they could peaceably cut up New York.
It was a pretty well-conceived organization. They could figure out how to subdivide territories. They could figure out how to assign businesses. That they could figure out even making decisions about whether to kill people.
The feds believe that the current chief of the Mafia Commission is none other than James LaRossa's longtime client, Big Paul Castellano, now head of the Gambino crime family.
Paul Castellano saw the economic future of the Mafia as combining legitimate business and illegitimate force. By controlling concrete, by controlling transportation, he was able to use mob muscle to make money through a variety of legitimate businesses. The problem for the Mafia was that as Paul Castellano led them out of the shadows, the leadership became more exposed, and it was that visibility which ultimately led to our ability to prosecute.
Under the leadership of Jules Bonavolanta, the Justice Department begins to target the hierarchies of the American mob.
They created units, squads, that would investigate each family in the country, each major family. In New York, there were 5 families, so they started investigating the 5 families.
Bugs were put in by the FBI that were aimed not at just overhearing crime conversations, but crime family conversations.
These electronic bugs, known among agents as Title IIIs, after the law that makes them legal, are the key to gathering evidence against the different mob bosses.
We had the Title IIIs in several social clubs. We had a Title III in Paul Castellano's house on Staten Island.
The FBI agents knocked on the door when they knew Castellano was out of town, spoke to Mrs. Castellano, and the agent said, "Why don't you call Jimmy LaRossa? We won't do anything unless he approves it." Followed her into the house, saw the layout of the kitchen, and laid out the physical location of the future wiretap. She called me, put them on the phone. And I said, please leave her. And by that time, they had the mental schematics drawn in their mind about where to put the bugs.
Posing as television repairmen, the FBI successfully installed bugs in Castellano's kitchen.
The ability to get a listening device in a location where the organized crime world feels comfortable about discussing business is a major coup.
It was months and months of bugging. They talked about everything around that table. Who didn't pay off? How many pinches of salt you put in the spaghetti sauce?
By 1983, investigations are well underway into all 5 of New York's mafia families. And that same year, a new U.S. attorney takes over in New York's Southern District, a tough go-getter fresh from Washington named Rudolph Giuliani.
What law enforcement has done in the past, by and large, is headhunt. We've convicted a few top people, and then congratulated ourselves and waited another 5 or 6 years and then convicted a few more.
Like Blakey, Giuliani is gunning for the commission, but he's got a dramatic new plan for doing it. Instead of prosecuting each family all the way up to the boss, Giuliani proposes to put all the bosses on trial together, a commission trial.
It actually helps organize everything. The commission case would just involve the heads of those 5 families. But then the rest of the members of the family could be prosecuted individually.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Attorney's Office decides it has so much evidence against Paul Castellano that he should be indicted on his own while the commission case is being prepared.
Castellano was indicted as the head of a faction of the Gambino crime family. They had stolen car operations, they had drug dealing operations, but essentially that group was involved in killing people who got in their way.
La Rossa takes the case and instantly goes on the attack.
We convinced the judge to sever the case into a multitude of different crimes.
The case that went to trial was not the strongest case in the world because it's cut apart all the murders and just put Castellano and the other defendants on trial for being involved in basically a stolen car operation.
We were devastated. We were saying, good Lord, we're going to be trying these cases for the next 10 years. Jim came out to me and said, now you know what it feels like to be a defense lawyer. Now you got to feel what it's like to have a devastating type of decision against you.
The government really never anticipated this piece of the case going to trial, and the witnesses had never mentioned Paul Castellano's name. So they got the witnesses to become re-interviewed and to suddenly remember that Paul Castellano once a week would get an envelope at his home in Staten Island.
When the trial begins on October 10th, 1985, the most dangerous witness La Rossa has to contend with is mob informant Dominic Montiglio, the nephew of Castellano's co-defendant, Anthony Nino Gaggi.
My uncle was basically the underboss of the Gambino family at the time. And he was a very, very powerful man. He ran probably the most murderous crew that's been around since Murder Incorporated.
Montiglio takes a stand on December 4th. His testimony is a central link between the stolen car operation and Paul Castellano.
I would go on Friday nights and get the money, and it would go to my uncle, and then it would get kicked upstairs to Paul, and that's how they stayed isolated from it.
But then James La Rossa gets his shot at Montiglio.
We found out where he lived, even though he was in protective custody, because Montiglio could not stay at a crime. We traced him to a southern city, selling heroin on the street. We traced him to Southern California, where he became head of a stick-up group. All of this evidence was categorized and ready to go when he took the stand. So the first thing we did was had him swear again and again and again and again and again that he never did anything wrong during this period. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he was really wearing the flag during this trial. And no, he would never deal in narcotics of any kind, and no, he would never rob anybody. That went on for days. The denials, and then the proof.
The litany of Dominic's sins begins. His dope dealing, his participation in armed robbery, and how he conveniently remembered key details only days before.
Jimmy did a good job of painting Dominic out to be the scum of the earth because they had inside information from Nino about all the bad things that Dominic had been involved in.
Did he have weaknesses? Absolutely. Many of those were brought out on cross. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about, gee, I wish I had known that, but how do we deal with that on redirect?
Dealing with a jury that heard a witness who admitted perjury, changed his testimony 3 or 4 times. It was one of the weakest cases I've ever handled.
My idea was that when he finished Montiglio and some of the other witnesses, there was no way this jury could convict Paul Castellano.
But even if Castellano's about to beat the car theft charges, he still has plenty of other problems, family problems.
Even members of the white-collar faction of the family were getting upset with Paul Castellano's leadership. They felt that he was making sweetheart deals that were profiting him and his blood family as opposed to the crime family.
Even worse, Big Paul has gotten himself into a struggle for power with an ambitious Gambino street captain named John Gotti.
Here he was, the boss of a crime family, sending out orders that he was going to dismantle John Gotti's crew. It was a simple message to John Gotti: you better act now or we're going to take you apart. Gotti said, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to go first.
It's December 1985, and winter is about to get much colder, as Paul Castellano walks in and out of New York's courtrooms on the arm of attorney James La Rossa.
You're watching Mouthpiece on the History Channel. In December 1985, New York defense attorney James La Rossa is confident he has the government beat, that a federal jury will acquit his client, Paul Castellano, of the car theft charges. But the courtroom is not the only place where Castellano's power is being challenged.
It was during a Christmas break in the trial, and he was on his way to Florida to spend a week's vacation, and stopped at the office to bring gifts to some of the girls in the office for Christmas.
Thank you so much, Mr. Castellano.
I think we've done very well with every government witness.
What we did that last time we met for just a few minutes was talk about how well we thought the trial was going, how we were looking forward to its resumption and conclusion, and how we were both convinced that we were going in the right direction.
Then Castellano leaves, heading for dinner at Sparks Steakhouse.
At about 5:30 in the afternoon, Tommy Bilotti and Paul Castellano pulled up in front of Sparks on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 46th Street. In a Lincoln were John Gotti and Sammy Gravano. Gravano's role at that point was to alert the shooters who were standing in front of Sparks when Tommy Bilotti's car pulled up. 4 men wearing coats and Russian hats looking identical came out from the shadows and blew them both away.
2 miles south, G. Robert Blakey is giving a lecture on RICO at New York University.
We had a cocktail party just before my lecture.
When all of a sudden a beeper went off, and then another beeper, and then another beeper.
And all the FBI agents and the Assistant United States Attorneys huddled in one corner. And then they came over and said, we can't stay. Castellano has just been hit.
Following the shooting, Gotti and Gravano kind of like just drove slowly on by the bodies laying on the sidewalk, and Sammy looked down and told John, they're gone.
I've been asked many, many times whether Paul Castellano should have seen that there was a danger lurking within his own group. I really don't know what he knew and what he didn't know. I mean, looking in hindsight now, I would say absolutely. He should have been a little more careful.
I think Sammy Gravano, John Gotti, that whole crew were amazed how little resistance there was to their coup effort. They felt that they were going to have a war. The crime family itself didn't bat an eyelash. Everybody bowed down and said, John, you're the boss, we're with you.
Castellano's death does not slow the government attack, and U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani presses on with his commission case and indicts 8 surviving mob chieftains for trial in September 1986. From the Colombo family, boss Carmine Jr. Persico, underboss Jerry Langlangella, and union operative Ralph Scopo. From the Genovese family, boss Fat Tony Solano, Bruno Indelicato, a captain in the disgraced Bonanno family. From the Lucchese's, boss Tony Dux Corallo, underboss Salvatore Tomic Santoro, and consigliere Christy Tick Fernare. And lining up with Fernare is defense attorney James LaRosa.
I started to receive some inquiries from other defendants in the commission case who wanted to take advantage of the fact that our office had done so much work on the case in terms of the tapes.
With the commission case, the art of electronic surveillance reaches its zenith. The tapes are crisp and clean, and the words are unmistakable.
Although the testimony of the witnesses was important, there was a solid core of the case that had been picked up through the surveillances, through the audio surveillances.
We actually overheard conversations where they used the term commission. We could finally portray to an American jury the existence of a hierarchical mafia that went back decades.
There was one boss of the Lucchese crime family by the name of Tony Corallo, and he used to drive around in a Jaguar with a guy by the name of Avellino.
Both vehicles depart.
And there was a tape in the car.
They never spoke on the phone.
Corrallo's getting out.
They only spoke when they thought that law enforcement wasn't around to intercept their conversations, and that clearly was in the car.
In that bug, we got incredible conversations. They discussed crimes of all types and of all natures.
He would say, Sal, when you're made, you do this and that, and when the boss calls you, this is the rule, and he gave him a complete lecture on organized crime.
That is our union, not that it's Jimmy Brown's union, not that it's Paul Castellano's union. It's theirs and ours. Let's take a son, a son-in-law, somebody, put them into the office, they got a job. Let's take somebody's daughter, whatever. She's the secretary. Let's staff it with our people. And when we say, go break this guy's balls, they go. Yeah, 7 o'clock in the morning to break the guy's balls.
The lawyers had a gigantic problem. The evidence was coming from the mouths of the defendants. There was no question what they were talking about. How do you defend somebody like that?
I believe there's crime, and I believe that people bind together in it. Therefore, you can call that an organized crime. I don't believe there's a commission. I don't believe there's a La Casa Nostra, and it has to be proven to me, and it has to be proven to an American jury.
The commission trial opens on September 19th, 1986.
Jimmy LaRosa was essentially the lead counsel, although it was no designation. He assumed that role by virtue of his status and stature and presence in a courtroom, and we all deferred to it.
We knew that, he's the type of defense lawyer you can't afford to make mistakes with. If we exposed a vulnerability, he would go right for it, and that he would be a tough courtroom adversary.
The prosecutors have prepared a classic RICO attack. First, they will demonstrate the existence of the enterprise. And second, they will try to prove a string of crimes committed in the interests of the Mafia Commission. Even in the opening statements, it becomes clear that this is a case like no other. In an unprecedented moment, Samuel Dawson, attorney for Tom McSantoro, gets to his feet and declares straight out that the Mafia is real.
He said, let me tell you something. There is a Mafia. There's no issue about it. And let's go to the next phase of this, okay?
Well, my eyes snapped open. Carmine Persico, I think I heard a safety going off. Fat Tony, who was half asleep, he snapped up and took off his sunglasses. You knew when that happened, he was dead serious.
The only possible way that they could win the case was by conceding that there was a mafia.
The strategy basically was to try and convince the jury to ignore the organized crime aspects of it and just zero in on the extortion.
Assistant U.S. Attorneys Michael Chertoff and John Savarese begin putting on their case on September 22nd. The tapes roll. The Mafia boss's own voices explain the commission and the everyday workings of La Casa Nostra.
You have something to say, Tony? Thank you. Short of getting a big magnet, taping it to my chest, and walking over to where all the government tapes were stacked up and giving him a bear hug, there wasn't a goddamn thing any of us were going to do.
And at the core of the case, Chertoff and Savarese accuse the commission members of extorting millions from New York's construction industry.
Any construction project that was over $2 million in the city of New York, the commission got a piece of.
It wasn't, as the government suggested, extortion where the alleged mob guys went and put guns to the heads of these owners of these companies. The owners of the companies came to them. It was a partnership. It was a criminal antitrust case, I'll give you that much, but it wasn't extortion.
The prosecutors also tie the defendants to one of New York's most gruesome mob assassinations.
The other crime that the defendants were accused of was the assassination of Carmine Galante, who was the boss of the Bonanno crime family in 1979 when he was blown away in Brooklyn while he was having dinner.
Galante was known as the biggest narcotics dealer within the mob. He was somebody that was feared, and for a variety of reasons, people within the mob didn't want him around.
For James LaRosa, the case is mostly a subtle job of gradually trying to separate his client, Christy Tecfornare, from the 7 other defendants in the courtroom.
He'd ask witnesses, well, did you see Fornari point a gun at somebody? Did you see Fornari beat anybody up? And the point was to create in the jury's mind a distinction between the popular image of mobsters as people who pull guns and beat people up and the evidence against Fornari, which did not show him using overt threats of force and violence. But of course, our response was to say, that's the difference between a soldier and a captain or a boss. The boss sits in the social club or in the restaurant and gives the orders because they don't actually get their hands dirty. They just order other people to do it.
The day that a defense lawyer gets up and walks into a courtroom and says, I'm dead, I'm just going through the motions, the case is over. So you certainly have to cling to the expectation and hope that you're proving this and be good enough advocate to argue it, no matter what the evidence is against you.
What little relief there is from the onslaught of evidence is usually provided by the speeches of Colombo boss Carmine Persico, who has decided to represent himself.
He defended himself because he felt that he would be able to get his position across to the jury by not taking the witness stand.
The jury loved it. I mean, here's this mafia leader getting up and cross-examining, and the jury would smile and snicker, you know, like each day became more and more of a defense lawyer.
Unfortunately for Carmine, he's not skilled enough to break the witnesses against him or to keep out damaging new evidence.
He damaged the case for everybody because he brought out information that seemed to suggest that there was loan sharking, that there was threats, that the commission did operate.
Persico, La Rossa, and all the other defense attorneys rest, and the case goes to the jury on November 12, 1986. New York and America wait for the verdict.
You're watching Mouthpiece on the History Channel.
November 20th, 1986. The jury in the commission case has deliberated for 8 days. When they announced they have reached a verdict.
The jurors walked in. All the defendants stood up. Here you had the bosses of all the 5 families standing, their attorneys standing. We were, to say the least, a little bit nervous.
We all knew that in some ways the entire government effort against the mafia was in the balance. If this case flopped, it would be a very, very powerful blow against the campaign to eliminate organized crime.
The judge asked the jury forewoman how she found the first defendant on the charge of conspiracy, and she yelled out guilty. Well, that was the first sign.
The judge asked her 170 times, how do you find defendant so-and-so or defendant so-and-so on this particular charge? In each case, the forelady answered guilty.
All 8 defendants are found guilty of every charge, including James La Rossa's client, Christy Ticfranari.
They tried the case in such a way that you listened to the tapes, you got very little evidence, there was nobody to cross-examine. It was a casebook picture, perfect prosecution, and nobody could do anything about it.
Sometimes I like to tell people, if it wasn't for the facts, I'd win every case. And there were certain facts in that case that, you know, when you play tapes like that, it's not easy.
In hindsight, all of those defendants would have been better off taking a plea. But they decided that they were going to be macho guys and live up to the code of the mob.
Tony Salerno and I stood up, we were ready for sentencing, and the judge goes into a 20-minute monologue, and he says at the end, oh, and by the way, here's your sentence. 100 years in the federal penitentiary. And we just looked, and I looked at Tony, he looked at me, we started cracking up. Then he went down to the next guy, was Jerry Langella. He gave a speech directed at him for 10 minutes. Then he gave him 100 years. Then he went to Carmine Persico, gave him 100 years. Tom Mix was next. Tom Mix got up. When the judge started, he said, hey, I don't need any f***ing stories. Give me my 100 and let me get the f*** out of here.
I think it's going to take a long time to replace the kind of network that these men put together.
It's not that we destroyed the mafia. What we did do was substantially damage its ability to control large segments of the economy.
They've diminished tremendously in power and influence. They had influence in politics, they had influence in courts, they had influence in businesses, legitimate businesses, in labor unions. So unraveling them, reducing their strength and power, was really significant in being able to save a lot of those organizations.
And we've been forcing them back systematically into the role of being kind of a street gang as opposed to the role of being a powerful economic actor in our cities across the country.
And thanks to his reputation as a world-class cross-examiner, La Rossa's losses have not kept him from getting new high-profile cases.
Jimmy has the deadly tenacity to paint a witness into a corner so that the next answer has got to kill that witness and kill the government's case. The Joe Watts murder trial in Staten Island, that was a case where he had to have been Houdini to get this guy off.
Joe Watts is a Gambino gangster. He was also an accomplished killer, according to court records that I've seen. At least a half a dozen people have gone down because of his work.
The story begins in 1987, when an unstable man named William Ciccone was thought to have fired a pistol at John Gotti in front of his Queens hangout, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club.
This was around the time Gotti was suspicious that the Genovese crime family was out to kill him. And when they heard a truck backfire, they thought that he had taken a pot shot.
One of the Gotti bodyguards brings the would-be assailant down with a single shot to the rear end. Now the Gotti crew wants to interrogate Ciccone.
According to the rat that the government used, Joe Watts was called in by John Gotti to take him over to Staten Island to a social club and find out who sent him and whether or not it was related to any other family. Joe Watts took the cable from the cable TV, used that to tie the guy's hands and legs, hang him up, and start flaying him essentially with a blowtorch. And when they got finished with this guy, he was burnt to the bone. And then he got two in the hat to finish him off.
Only hours later, police stumble across the bullet-riddled, wire-bound body of William Ciccone in the basement of a Staten Island sweet shop. The case remains unsolved until 8 years later, when a 400-pound Gambino-made man named Dominic Fat Dom Borghese calls the FBI and tells them that Joe Watts murdered William Ciccone.
Borghese brings him to the place. Even though it's years later, there's still blood where this guy was hanging. The cables had been ripped out. There's definitely marks around the rafter where this guy was swinging.
It looks like an open and shut case, but then Joe Watts hires James LaRossa, and LaRossa begins to do his homework on Fat Dom.
The work that went into this convinced us that the witness had completely lied to the prosecutors and was only telling 5% of the story.
By the time the trial begins in May 1997, James LaRossa has found the turncoat's Achilles heel. He's cheap.
He signed an affidavit so that they would give him a free lawyer saying that he was indigent and had no monies. We followed monies into bank accounts that he and his wife had and a safe deposit box, which in the middle of cross-examination, and he denied even existed. Obviously,
LaRossa and his team of investigators bring Borghese's safe deposit box into the courtroom in the middle of the trial.
The judge ordered opened in front of the jury, and there was $165,000 in cash and about $500,000 worth of jewelry in that box.
You hid the money, didn't you? LaRossa demands of Fat Dom. Not too good, Dom replies. You found it.
Money is a big factor in these things because the juries absolutely despise the fact that the witness could have stolen money in one form or another and secreted it for his future life. And the government's going to take this man and give him a new name and a new identity and a new home.
When I heard that trial was going on, I stopped the presses, came down to New York, got a hotel room, and took the ferry over every day to watch Jimmy.
Sometimes the cross has nothing to do with the events that the witness is testifying about. If a person lies under oath as to a material fact, the jury has a right to say, I don't believe one word he says, and discards his testimony completely.
And guess what? Jimmy LaRossa walked Joe Watts out of that courtroom with his cross-examination of Dom Borghese.
And he does it without ever really breaking down Borghese's version of the murder.
I hope that's what people consider classic Jim LaRossa cross, because it's hard work, it's put together appropriately, and it results in an acquittal.
Jimmy LaRossa's legacy, I believe, will be that he has served as an icon in our profession. Every one of us who believe in what we do and believe that we are standing between our clients and the incredible might, majesty, and wrath of the United States government. If anyone could teach you how to do that and do it in a dignified, effective way, it's Jimmy LaRossa.
I don't think I could have ever found anything that I would have preferred to do except play first base for the Brooklyn Dodgers when they were in Brooklyn, but I knew I was going to come up short on that. This is what I want to do, this is what I want to be known for, and I still love it and always will.
Every defense lawyer will tell you that they're keeping the system honest. James LaRossa has really done it for 40 years. And he's done it so well that even his most passionate adversaries are members of his fan club. That's no small accomplishment. Today, many defenders believe that the once cordial relations across the aisle have been tainted with distrust. I'm Bruce Cutler telling you that whether you stand with the defense or the prosecution in the fight for justice, a lawyer has to be able to roll with the punches.